invite Dr. Kavita.
Yes, sir.
Welcome, Dr. Kavita, and we are waiting to hear a talk on how effective is CM prophylaxis in renal transplant recipients. I invite you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everyone. Myself, Dr. Kavita Mudliar, DNB Nephrology postgraduate from NU Hospitals, Bangalore. Today, my paper is about how effective is CMV prophylaxis in renal transplant recipients. Until 2013, the incidence of CMV infection in our center was approximately 15%, and clinical audit done in 2015 showed that quite a few recipients had patient and graft loss associated with CMV infection. Our protocol for CMV prophylaxis till then included patients with D plus R minus serology status, irrespective of induction method used. Literature review suggested that most studies quote incidence of CMV infection as a percentage of cohort and not in patient years. Hence, a decision was made to apply universal prophylaxis for CMV infection to patients from January 2016, irrespective of serology status, and to study the incidence of CMV infection in patient years. Our objective was to study the efficacy and safety of CMV prophylaxis in renal transplant patients. Patients who underwent renal transplant between January 2009 to December 2015 received prophylaxis when the CMV serology status was D plus R minus, and others did not receive prophylaxis. However, all patients, irrespective of the serology status, received CMV prophylaxis from January 2016. Ours was a retrospective comparative analysis between the non-prophylaxis and prophylaxis group. Induction was done with interleukin-2 receptor alpha inhibitors, injection basiliximab, and it was given to recipients with a spousal donor, cadaveric donor transplants, and sibling donors with less than haplomatch. We did not use anti-thymocyte globulin in any of these patients. Immunosuppression was given with standard triple drug regimen consisting of prednisolone, mycophenolate, and tacrolimus. Diagnosis of CMV infection was done with CMV DNA PCR, qualitative and quantitative, in patients presenting with leukopenia, allograft dysfunction, transaminitis, or any unexplained fever. And study period was between January 2009 to August 2021. 3 patients who had received CMV prophylaxis indicated by the D plus R minus serology status and were transplanted prior to December 2015 were also included under the prophylaxis group. Valganciclovir was used for CMV prophylaxis, 450 mg once a day, once renal function was stable or dose was modified as per renal function. And medical records were also analyzed for the side effects related to CMV prophylaxis. Follow-up period was censored at first episode of CMV infection, and follow-up period was calculated in patient years. Coming to the results, of the total patients who did not receive prophylaxis, we had a total number of 135, of which 18 patients developed CMV infection, making it an incidence of 13.3% and 3.19 in 100 patient years. The mean age was 35.8. In the prophylaxis group, out of 49 patients, 1 patient developed CMV infection with an incidence of 2% and 0.7 in 100 patient years. The mean age was 34.4. Of the patients who developed CMV infection in the non-prophylaxis group, 6 patients had we had patient loss and 12 graft loss happened, and time to infection was 9 in within 3 months of transplant and 8 in more than 6 months post-transplant. In the prophylaxis group, 1 patient developed CMV infection, and at a time to infection was more than 6 months post-transplant. 16.3% of the patients had leukopenia in the prophylaxis group associated with valganciclovir, and 6 of them required colony stimulating factor for improvement of counts. 1 patient had transaminitis. Literature from CMC Vellore on infections in post-renal transplant patients also supports that CMV prophylaxis reduces incidence of CMV infection to less than 10% compared to the non-prophylaxis recipients, wherein the incidence is 20 to 30%. So to conclude, Though the numbers are small, there is evidence of significantly lower incidence of CMV infection when expressed both in percentage of cohort and patient years, but with a risk of leukopenia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kavita, for the beautiful presentation and sticking to the time. If you have one question, we can take from the audience. Dr. Kavita, normally we give 900 milligrams per day. Or normally we give 900 milligrams per day. Why did we give 450 milligram per day for these patients?
Sir, actually, we went through the literature and we found that there is not a major difference in the dosage used, and the incidence of infection was around the same. Second reason being cost, and also patients were having good response to it with 450 mg as well.
Speakers and moderators, kindly note that the allotted time for this session is 6 minutes. That is 5 minutes for the presentation and 1 minute for the discussion. Thank you, sir. I now invite the next speaker, Dr. Shruti Tapiawala. The free paper topic is an observation study of 100 consecutive HLA cross matches in an HLA laboratory, their correlation with solid phase assays.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Shruti Tapiawala. I am a transplant physician and a director at a lab, an HLA lab, and this is an observational study of cross matches and its correlation with solid phase assays. I'm not able to advance the slides. So complement dependent cytotoxicity and flow cross match were designed to identify the presence of preformed DSAs. CDC crossmatch and flow crossmatch will miss low or very low titer and give false negative crossmatches, which can mislead us and lead to rejections. We know that even low titers can be dangerous and very low titers are not picked up. PRA screen, panel reactive antibody, can identify the presence of HLA antibodies even in low titers. If the PRA screen is positive, then we know that a single antigen bead assay will be able to predict and identify donor-specific antibodies. Our aim was to study cross-matches, understand the prevalence of true and false positive, true and false negative cross-matches after correlating the findings with solid phase assays like panel reactive antibody screen and SAB assays against HLA class 1 and class 2 antigens. 100 consecutive incidental cross matches from 1st December 2020 to 15th August 2021 performed at our laboratory were studied. Samples for the CDC crossmatch and flow crossmatch with simultaneous samples for PRA screen or percentage or SAB were included. A sample with solid phase assays within the preceding months were also included. All CDC crossmatches were AHG enhanced and included T-cell, B-cell, auto crossmatch, allo crossmatch, and if an auto crossmatch was positive, then a DTG treatment was given. Pronase treatment was performed on the sample if the B-cell Frio crossmatch was noted to be positive. A PRA screen, percentage PRA, and single antigen bead assays against the HLA class 1 and class 2 antigens were performed using 1 lambda kits on FlexMap 3D platform. 97 CDC cross matches and 89 flow cross matches were studied from 74 patients and 100 samples. Only CDC cross matches were performed on 11 samples and only flow was performed on 3 samples. In 22 samples, CDC and flow cross match were done more than once. These were the results and the correlation with the solid phase assays. So in 68 samples, CDC negative, flow negative, and DSA negative means there were no DSAs and this was true negative. CDC positive, flow positive, DSA positive in 3 samples. This is true positive cross matches. CDC positive, flow negative, DSA negative, 1 sample. So this was a false positive CDC cross match. CDC positive, flow positive, DSA negative, false negative virtual cross match. This I will come to later. CDC negative, flow negative, DSA positive. So these were 5 samples which were false negative cross matches, which is very important to note. CDC positive, DSA positive in 1. That means this was true positive. CDC negative, DSA negative in 9. True negatives. CDC negative and DSA positive in 1, where low titer DSA must have been present and the CDC came negative. Flow crossmatch negative, DSA negative. 3 samples, true negatives. 3 B-cell flow cross matches were positive and identified as false positive after pronase treatment. All the 3 patients gave a history of receiving Ritux. 2 B-cell auto cross matches were positive, which were identified false positive after DTG treatment. 19 samples in 13 patients were positive and screened for PRA, and DSAs were identified in 11 samples, 6 of whom had negative CDC and flow cross match. Notable. One patient had false negative virtual cross match, absence of allele representation on the beads. So to conclude, 11% of samples had donor specific antibodies. Prevalence of true positive HLA cross matches is 5%. False negative cross matches is 6% in present study. Notably, 6% of cross matches are negative with DSAs positive. The PRA screen in all these cases were positive, highlighting the need to screen and identify antibodies. Allele and antigen representations on the beads should be taken into account. All cross matches should be interpreted in conjunction with solid phase assays like PRA screen and or single antigen bead assays. Thank you.
Thank you, Shruti ma'am. Thanks for the excellent information. I just have a question. Suppose CDC is negative in a patient, do we still have to go ahead with a DSA and flow cytometry?
So I would say based on this, if we have done only a CDC and you've got it negative, there might be a low titer antibody which a PRA screen will pick up. You don't need to do DSA. You need to do just a screen. The screen is a very cheap test. It's not expensive. 6,000 to 7,000 is nothing when you're doing such a big transplant. So once you do a PRA screen, you come to know the class 1 or class 2 whether the screening is negative or positive. It's negative, the CDC is true negative. But if your screen comes positive, you get a highlight that, okay, class 1 or class 2, there is an antibody and you better identify if it is against a donor.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
11% of our population turned out to be positive.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, moderators. Next, I invite Dr. Sahil Rally. The topic of his presentation is Comparative Analysis of Outcomes of Lymphocyte Depleting Agent, a Single Center Experience.
Yeah, please go ahead, Dr.
Brief
Sahil.
introduction. The lymphocyte depleting agents are known since the late 1960s, which are available for induction therapy as well as the treatment of intractable acute rejections. They effectively prevent rejection by inhibiting the T cell functions. And these beneficial effects have encouraged to develop the sequential protocols of ATG in the induction followed by the triple immunosuppression. The KDIGO guidelines to recommend the ATG induction for the high-risk immunological patients. The use of the ATG has gone up in the US from 60 to 80% since 2006 as per the OPTN 2018 report. So this was a retrospective analysis done in the Department of Renal Transplant Surgery of PGH Chandigarh. Patients were enrolled from January 1, 2017 to December 31, 2019 and were followed for a total of 3 years. A total of 444 patients were analyzed in this study. Out of these, 202 patients were given ATG induction and 242 patients were not given the induction based on the immunological profile of the patient. The data of the patients was recorded electronically on the Microsoft Access and was extracted to the Excel sheets and Kaplan analysis was done. The aims and objectives of the studies was to compare the graft outcomes in respect of the risk of early and late rejections, risk of early and late infections, and the graft function at 0 months, 1 year, and the last follow-up. Coming to the results, this is the first slide. The first table shows the donor age and recipient age, which is quite comparable. 41.3 plus minus 9.6 and 46.9 plus minus 10 years in the ATG and non-ATG group.
Sorry for
the
the
male to
sir.
female ratio was around 1.5:1 in the donor.
Can you put the slides in?
The donors in the non-ATG group, and the p-value was not significant in such a case. The rate of early rejection in this study was 13.7% in the ATG group and 13.6% in the non-ATG group, which was quite comparable. However, the rate of the incidence of late rejection was quite high in the non-ATG group, around 10.7%, which was quite significant with a p-value of around 0.025. Similarly, the creatinine at discharge in the two groups was quite statistically significant. At discharge, the p-value was around 0.015. At 1 year, it was 0.005, and at the last follow-up, it was 0.002. So the graft function is quite significant, and it is better than the ATG group than in the non-ATG group. The rate of early infection was 8.9% the ATG, which was comparable to the non-ATG group, which was around 11.6% with no p-value of around 0.35. However, the late infection was quite significantly higher in the non-ATG group, around 22.8% with the p-value of around 0.036. This is the graft survival curve in the Kaplan-Meier graph, which is the first graph is showing the death-sensitive patient survival with a p-value of around 0.055, and the graft survival in the death-sensitive graft survival in the ATG group was around 95% at the 3 months at the 3 years follow-up. However, it was around 89-88% in the non-ATG group compared to ATG group, which was around 97%. Similarly, the graft survival was in ATG group was around 97 and 98% in the ATG group at the 3 years follow-up, and it was around 96% in the non-ATG group. Coming to the discussion. In our study, the incidence of late infection was quite high in the non-induction group, and this may be probably due to the high incidence of rejection and anti-rejection therapy given to this group. However, the 3-year graft survival and death-sensitive graft survival is not statistically significant. Conclusion: ATG induction has benefit of low incidence of rejection, better graft function, and infection rates are comparable and are not high as opposed to what we think. ATG induction might be considered in every patient. However, further studies are warranted to evaluate the fact. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, moderators. Now invite the next speaker, Dr. Akhilesh Jaiswal. The topic of the free paper is Phosphodiesterase 5x5-HT 2-dual inhibitors abrogate completely fibrotic potential of human renal fibroblasts isolated from renal allograft rejection patients.
I would like to thank Indian Society of Organ Transplant for giving me the opportunity. Here I am presenting my topic, phosphodiesterase 5-HT2 dual inhibitor abrogate completely fibrotic potential of human renal fibroblast isolated from renal allograft rejection patients. Despite improvement in immunosuppressive therapy, long-term allograft survival after kidney transplantation remains as low as 50%. The tubular interstitial fibrosis is the final common pathway of progressive renal diseases. In allograft, it is accessed with tubular atrophy as IFTA. IFTA occurs in about 40% of kidney allograft at 3 to 6 months after kidney transplantation, increasing to 65% at 2 years. Serotonin produces extracellular matrix protein in presence of TGF-beta dependent manner. TGF-beta1 activates resident fibroblast, transdifferentiate into myofibroblast, which is the hallmark of pathogenesis of fibrosis. TGF-beta ligands binds with TGF-beta receptor 2, which leads to ALK5 dependent canonical signaling through SMAD3 and non-canonical signaling through SRC and subsequent ERK and P38 and other kinases. SMAD2 and SMAD3 with SMAD4 translocate into nucleus and activate transcription of target genes. All the non-canonical pathway ultimately leads to STAT3, which then downstream regulates fibrosis. On the above background, our objective was to evaluate the anti-fibrotic efficacy of phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitor sildenafil and 5-HT2 inhibitor PSB204741 in combination on renal fibroblast isolated from allograft renal allografts. To achieve our objective, we collected three allograft biopsies from recipients and 3 nephrectomy samples as control. Human renal fibroblast isolated from allograft biopsy were cultured. Renal fibroblasts were subpassaged with 0.25 trypsin EDTA. cells from third passage were pre-treated with inhibitors individual and in combination.
Now I invite the next speaker, Dr. Mantabya Kumar Singh. The topic of his presentation is chronic antibody-mediated rejection in patients transplanted with renal allografts activates an inflammatory amplifying loop when prolonged IL-6 secretion occurs.
Good afternoon to all of you. My topic of presentation is chronic antibody-mediated rejection in patient transplanted with renal allograft activated inflammatory amplifying group, that is IL-6/17, when prolonged IL-6 secretion occur. We all know that the chronic antibody-mediated rejection remains a major hurdle in the long-term graft survival, and its management is still challenging for us. And for that, most important cytokine that play a role in the chronic inflammation is IL-6. Study suggested that the interaction between the non-immune cells or immune system play a critical role in the chronic inflammation and late allograft rejection. Previous study suggested that the only alloreactive T cell and de novo DSA responsible for the late-term graft loss, but recent studies suggested that not only immune cell, non-immune cells like fibroblast also play important role in the chronic inflammation and allograft rejection via IL-6 amplifier loop. Here, when prolonged IL-6 secretion occur, that activate the Th17 cell to secrete more IL-17, and together with IL-6 plus IL-17 activate the NF-kappa B and STAT3 signal transduction pathway. They promote the recruitment of immune cells via chemokines, that is CCL2 and CCL20, and promote the inflammation. So my objective of the presentation is first to study the effect of IL-6 plus IL-17 on the secretion of IL-6 in the culture superattendant of fibroblast derived from the renal biopsy of CABMR patient. Second, to elucidate the effect of anti-IL-6 and anti-IL-17 on the secretion of IL-6 with the fibroblast derived from the kidney tissue of CABMR patient. So, I cultured the fibroblast from the 6 biopsy-proven CABMR patient and then stimulated with IL-6, IL-17 and IL-6 plus 17 for 24 hours, and the level of IL-6, MCP1 and CCL20 were estimated in the culture simulated by ELISA as a marker of amplifier loop. Where the mRNA expression of IL-6, MCP1, CCL20 and SOX3 gene were measured in the stimulated fibroblast. Additionally, the serum IL-6, MCP1 and CCL20 level were measured in the healthy control CABMR and non-CABMR patients. For the inhibition experiment, primary renal fibroblasts were stimulated with IL-6, IL-17 and IL-6 plus 17, and after in inhibition experiment, anti-IL-6 and anti-IL-17 were added to the culture 30 minutes before the cytokine stimulation. Coming to the result section, when fibroblasts stimulated with IL-6 plus IL-17 together, they secrete 3 to 4 times more IL-6 as compared to individual stimulation with IL-6 or IL-17. And these results consistent with all 6% of the CABMR. While the level of CCL2 and CCL20 in the culture superattendant were also significantly higher when fibroblast cell stimulated with IL-6 or IL-17 together as compared to individual stimulation. In the serum, sera level of IL-6, CCL2 and CCL20 level also a significant increased its level in the CABMR patient as compared to either healthy control or non-CABMR patient. Gene expression analysis also suggested that the gene expression of IL-6, CCL2 and CCL20 were significant increased when fibroblast cell stimulated with together as compared to stimulated alone, while SOX3 gene, which is known as the negative regulator of IL-6 signaling, has decreased when fibroblast cell stimulated with IL-6 plus 17 together. That again prove my hypothesis that prolonged IL-6 secretion promote the chronic inflammation via IL-6 amplifier loop. Then when inhibition in the inhibition experiment, when fibroblast cell inhibited with tocilizumab plus anti-IL-17 together, the significant reduction occurred in the IL-6 secretion as compared to, we concluded that So our data patients from CABMRs. Hello.
Yeah, there was some network
Data
issue.
of patients supported at the CABMR is perpetuated by the inflammation amplifier or synergistic induction of IL-6 and plus IL-17, which result in the recruitment of immune cell that result in the chronic inflammation and subsequent allograft rejection. Inhibition of IL-6 with anti-IL-6 and IL-17 with anti-IL-17 reduces the tissue injury marker and allograft rejection.
Thank you, Dr. Mandeva. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, moderators. Next, I'd like to invite the next speaker, Brijesh Yadav. The topic of his presentation is Monitoring of Antibody Response of Anti-SARS-CoV-2 Vaccination and SARS-CoV-2 Infection in Renal Transplant Recipient Patients.
So today I'm going to present my paper, that is monitoring of antibody response of anti-SARS-CoV-2 vaccination and SARS-CoV-2 infection in renal transplant recipient patient. So the induction of SARS-CoV-2 neutralizing antibodies and its neutralizing activities and its persistent remains a disputed challenge for the successful vaccination program across the world. And further, in the kidney transplant patient mRNA-based vaccine, they show that these renal transplant patients, they are poorly developing any humoral and cellular response in terms of T and B cell activation. Because these mRNA vaccines, they are showing the poor response in the Western population. The protein subunit-based vaccine has been not tested. And here we have evaluated the seroconversion rate of our Covishield and Covaxin, that is a protein-based vaccine. So the objective of our study is to measure the humoral response of vaccine, these Covishield and Covaxin vaccine, and those who have the natural SARS-CoV infections in terms of the IgG seroconversion. So for this, we have recruited 220 live-related renal transplant patients from our OPD, and we further categorize these patients in 4 groups. So in group 1, that was asymptomatic group. These patients, they do not have history of SARS-CoV infection, or they have the history of the vaccination, but they have the seroconversion after the analysis. And in the group 2, the symptomatic patient, they have no history of the infection, but they have the history. They have the history of the SARS-CoV infection. And in the group 3, the patient do not have the history of the infection, but they have the history of vaccination. And in the group 4, patient have both the vaccination history as well as the COVID infection history. So we collected blood from them, and we analyzed their immunoglobulin IgG level was against the SARS-CoV spike protein, and based on the greater than 50 AU per ml IgG titer level, we consider them IgG positive and seroconversion, and less than 50 AU per ml was defined as negative and no seroconversion. So this is the baseline demographic and clinical profile of the patient, which was similar in all of the group except the age of the age in 4th group that was significantly higher, and this was also similar like TLC1 and tacrolimus, and so this is like this seroconversion rate and percentage positivity. So in the asymptomatic group, the 83% patient develop seroconversion, and the median IgG level was 563 AU per ml. In the symptomatic group, 93% patient develop IgG antibody, and the median titer was 680 AU per ml. And in group 4, 70% patient develop IgG antibody against SARS-CoV spike 2 protein, and median titer was 1400 AU per ml. And in the group 4, which have the both infections and 2 doses of the vaccination, they have the 95% seroconversion rate, and median titer was 1800 AU per ml. So further, we analyze the efficacy of this Covaxin and Covishield in terms of the anti-SARS-CoV spike protein specific IgG conversion, and this figure shows like both have the equal efficacy in terms of the IgG seroconversion. So further we analyze the clinical variables which impact the seroconversion rate. So we have found like SARS-CoV infection and vaccination associated seroconversion was higher, and the patient who have a younger age, they have the more seroconversion rate. And the other variable like blood group and immunosuppression, they were not impacting the seroconversion in our population. So the conclusion of our study is the overall seroconversion rate in renal transplant patients was 86%, and almost half of the patient have the natural acquired asymptomatic SARS-CoV infection in the second wave, and infection and both dose of the vaccination induce a robust antibody formation in renal transplant recipient patient, and both Covaxin and Covishield vaccine is equally effective in inducing anti-SARS-CoV spike protein antibody generation in renal transplant recipient patient. So thanks to all of you for finding it.
Thank you, Dr. Brijesh. Thank you very much. I think we can go to the next presentation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, moderators. Moving on, I'd like to invite the next speaker, Dr. Sabrinath S. The topic of his free paper is the outcomes of biopsy-proven acute rejection in ABO incompatible kidney transplants compared with propensity-matched cohort of ABO-compatible renal transplant recipients.
Good evening, for the opportunity to present me in this podium. My presentation is on outcomes of biopsy-proven acute rejection in ABO-incompatible kidney transplants compared with the propensity-matched cohort of ABO-compatible transplants. So as we all know, ABO-incompatible kidney transplants increase the pool of living donation. Although most of the studies have compared the graft survival between ABO-compatible and the ABO-incompatible groups, and many single-center studies have shown non-inferiority in the graft and the patient survival, none of the studies, to our knowledge, have analyzed the graft survival after an episode of biopsy-proven acute rejection. So the study question is, what would be the graft survival after an acute rejection in ABO-incompatible transplant recipients? How does the graft survival differ from ABO-compatible recipients who had an acute rejection? So we did not have any data in the literature, and hence we proceeded with the study. So the aim was to analyze the graft outcomes of biopsy-proven acute rejection in ABO-incompatible kidney transplants and compare them with the propensity-matched cohort of ABO-compatible transplants with biopsy-proven acute rejection within the same time period. That is, the transplants done between 2014 and 2019. So this was the study design. This is a retrospective case control study which was conducted in our department. Out of 815 live renal transplants done between 2014 and 2019, 103 were ABO incompatible, and we excluded 3 patients because they were second renal transplant and 1 died during desensitization. Out of 100 ABO incompatible patients, we had 37 cases, that is, they had biopsy proven acute rejection and they were taken as cases. Among the ABO compatible group, there were 712 patients. We excluded 32 second renal transplants, and out of 680 compatible transplants, 97 had biopsy-proven acute rejection. And to balance the baseline characteristics between these two groups, we used a statistical tool, that is the propensity score matching, and we have taken 37 controls by matching 1:1 algorithm. So the variables included for matching were donor age, donor sex, donor GFR, induction agent used, and the HLA match. Tacrolimus was the maintenance therapy in all the patients. So the outcomes of the study were, what is the biopsy proven acute rejection free period of the graft in the cases and the propensity matched control? What is the post rejection graft survival in terms of response to therapy and type of rejection? And what is the overall graft survival in patients with acute rejection? So the data were presented as mean, and continuous variables were compared using Student's t-test, and categorical variables were analyzed using Fisher's exact test. We estimated Kaplan-Meier survival in the matched pair cohort and compared them using the log rank test. A p-value of less than 0.05 was considered statistically significant. So we defined the early acute rejection as rejections that happen less than 6 months, and late acute rejection as rejections that happen more than 6 months. And the degree of reversibility of rejection was determined by comparing the post-treatment creatinine with the pre-treatment serum creatinine, and we classified them as three categories: those patients with complete recovery, and those with partial recovery, and those with no recovery. The graft loss was taken as HD dependency. So coming to the results, the demographic and the clinical characteristics were comparable in both the groups. Those that I have highlighted in red are the parameters that we have included in the propensity matching. Except for ABO incompatibility, other immunological factors like HLA matches, pre-transplant DSA, CDC, flow cytometry were not statistically significant in both the groups. In those who had pre-transplant DSA positivity in ABO compatible, 7 patients had and 11 in ABO incompatible. None had significant pre-transplant DSA MFIs requiring desensitization for HLA incompatibility. All patients received induction therapy either with IL-2 receptor blockers or with ATG, which was not significant between both the groups. And maintenance immunosuppression in all consisted of prednisolone, tacrolimus, and mycophenolate mofetil. The baseline creatinine values were similar between both the groups. And after transplant, those patients who attained normal graft function, delayed graft function, and those who had slow graft function were also similar between both the groups. Coming to the analysis of the results, the time to the first acute in both early rejection in incompatible group, the time for first acute rejection between the two groups was statistically insignificant. Early acute rejection occurred in 78% versus 46% and percent in ABO incompatible and if we analyze further, early acute ABMR or mixed rejection were more common in ABO incompatible kidney transplant recipients, whereas the late acute cellular rejections were more common in ABO compatible kidney transplant recipients. Coming to the therapies used, there was no significant difference in the anti-rejection therapies used. The response to treatment was also similar. Those who had complete response, partial response, and no response was also similar between both the groups. The mean follow from rejection was 34 months in ABO incompatible and 54 months in ABO statistically significant because the number of patients which we have taken up in the ABO incompatible group were somewhat earlier transplanted to ABO incompatible group. So, coming to the histopathological band scoring analysis, the mean band score were similar in both ABO incompatible and ABO compatible kidney transplant recipients, except for the interstitial inflammation, which were significantly higher in ABO compatible kidney transplant recipients. The capacity parameters were
sorry for the interruption,
that
sir.
data was not in here.
Sorry for the interruption, sir. The allotted time for you has been
patients
exceeded.
with the number of patients with ITG. There was no difference in the histopathological scores among patients who attained complete remission, partial remission, and no remission in ABO incompatible groups. But
Sorry for the
in
interruption,
ABO
sir.
compatible kidney transplant recipients, the TA score was significantly higher in patients with partial response and no response when compared to complete response, and the microvascular inflammation score was higher in patients with partial response when compared to complete response. So this is the Kaplan-Meier graph showing the overall graft survival. The overall graft survival of ABO incompatible kidney transplant recipients were 86%, 72 and 50%, whereas in ABO compatible it is 97%, 91 and 79% at 1, 3 and 5 years respectively, which were all statistically significant. Compared to the post-rejection graft survival, we estimated 3 years graft survival after an episode of rejection. In ABO incompatible group, it was 63%, whereas in ABO compatible, it was 92%, which was significantly different. Coming, whatever may be the type of rejection, whether it is an acute cellular rejection, if we see in that, those patients in ABO incompatible behaved badly at 3 years when compared to the ABO compatible group. Similar the case in ABMR and the mixed rejection cases also. At 3 years, ABO incompatible patients, the graft survival was 65%, whereas in ABO compatible, it is 89%. So this graph depicts the post-rejection graft survival according to the response to the therapy. Patients having complete response in both the groups and partial response in ABO compatible groups had better survival. Whereas those patients with partial response in ABO incompatible KTRs and no response in ABO compatible kidney transplant had somewhat inferior survival group. And those patients who had worse than the ABO incompatible group, they behaved badly. So, to conclude my talk, the time to acute rejection did not differ statistically in both the groups, although there was a trend towards early rejection in ABO incompatible transplant. The mean band score were similar in both ABO incompatible and compatible groups, except for tubulointerstitial inflammation, which were significantly higher in ABO compatible. Although the therapies used and the initial overall response after anti-rejection therapy were similar in both the groups, the graft survival in ABO incompatible groups deteriorated significantly over time. Thus, the overall graft survival and post-rejection graft survival was inferior in ABO incompatible group. The strength of the study is the groups are comparable because the controls are chosen by propensity matching, and the limitation of the study is small sample size because the number of rejections the patient had was less. It's 7% in ABO compatible and 37% in ABO incompatible in our cohort, and it's a retrospective analysis. And we did not do post-transplant survey biopsies unless monitoring to know like why the ABO incompatible group behaved badly when compared to ABO compatible group, although the response to therapy was similar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shabanya. That's a very interesting presentation by you.
Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Dipesh B. Kenwar. The topic of his presentation is Risk Factors for Mortality in Kidney Transplant Recipients in COVID-19 Infection.
Okay, so I'll be presenting on the risk factors for mortality in kidney transplant recipients with COVID-19 infection. This is a single center study. So the first confirmed case happened in January 2020 in Kerala, and we've arbitrarily taken the second wave till March 2021. And during that duration, 14 million COVID-19 patients were reported and 177,000 deaths were reported till April 18, 2021. This is from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare website. A literature comparing solid organ transplant recipients and general population shows obviously that they have an increased mortality, and this ranges from study to study. They've reported between about 12% to as high as 42%. So an overall mortality comes to around 18.6% in a meta-analysis. The Indian multi-center study had a case fatality rate of 11.6%. However, there is relatively scant literature from developing nations, including India, on COVID-19. Although worldwide, if you see, COVID-19 is probably one of the most widely reported infectious diseases till now. So this is a retrospective center study at our center. In a very short summary, we have a case fatality rate of 20.2% with a mean age of 41.1 years. We have a relatively high incidence of co-infections, 12.65%, and surprisingly it was cytomegalovirus which was the most common. Co-infection is a strong predictor of mortality on multiple logistic regression analysis, and others which were other factors which were associated with high mortality were diarrhea, lymphopenia at presentation, tacrolimus withdrawal, and COVID reinfection. About 2/3 of our patients had a rise in serum creatinine during the COVID-19 infection, and 1 in 8 patients developed a biopsy-proven acute rejection after they recovered from COVID-19. So going in detail, with a single center retrospective study, patients and the data was taken between April 2020 and March 2021. We had a consent waiver due to the ongoing pandemic. These patients had self-reported to us either having been diagnosed already with as having COVID-19 or had symptoms suggestive of COVID-19, and then that was confirmed. So all patients had a positive RT-PCR to diagnose COVID-19. We have a total of 599 patient months of follow-up, and we had 79 patients who had developed COVID-19. These are all self-reported. The primary outcome was death, and 16 recipients died and 63 survived. Then after this is the set of parameters that we compared. So basically that was the demographics, the transplant characteristics, the comorbid illnesses that they had prior to it, the COVID-19 illness itself that they had, and the graft function that they had during and after the COVID-19 episode. And then this is the short summary of the statistical analysis that we did. We considered a p-value of less than 0.05 as significant, and all analysis was done on SPSS. As regards to management of COVID-19, so we are a tertiary care government hospital, and all patients who were who presented to us, we took care of them. When they first, when the protocol was developed, so they were receiving dexamethasone 6 milligrams once a day, along with remdesivir for 5 days in patients with severe disease. Mycophenolate was reduced or stopped in patients who required admission, and tacrolimus was stopped if the saturation was less than 92%. And immunosuppressive drugs were recommended after recovery. So as and how the pandemic progressed, so this slightly changed. So we were on the whole introducing immunosuppression at about 2 weeks after the first onset of symptoms. We obviously had some issues because guidelines were evolving and practices were very during the first wave. Also, there was very strict implementation of which hospital took care of which patients. So we had patients who were just 10-15 kilometers away from us but had to go to almost a primary healthcare center for the initial treatment. Protocols were highly available. Patients were getting dexamethasone, hydrocortisone, prednisolone, all depending upon what the local physician thought appropriate at that time. They got hydrochloroquine, ivermectin, doxycycline, azithromycin, piperacillin-tazobactam, oxygen, and even in some cases methylene blue through. So these are the results that I'm showing. So baseline demographics have highlighted the parameters which are at or near significance. So age greater than 60 years, probably reaching significance, but that will depend on further analysis of a larger number of patients. And same thing with the baseline creatinine. You would expect that these factors will have an impact, but not at this current sample size that we have of 79 patients. Creatinine in the presentation, definitely that had an impact on what's happening to the patients.
Sorry
and
for the
all
interruption, sir.
Clinicals. Hello.
The allotted time for you has been exceeded. I kindly request you to conclude the session.
Okay, so this is diarrhea was one of the things which was prominent, and then co-infection at time of COVID, like I said before. Many of these parameters that are coming out are actually the result of COVID that we have. I've just got 2 more slides. So the mean time from transplantation was higher in the non-survivors, lower in the survivors. Diarrhea was prominent. Again, hospital stays more of a marker of COVID disease rather than a factor which predisposes to COVID mortality. Now, 30 of all the patients who were hospitalized here in our center, 30% of them expired. 3 patients died at home after discharge. 2 patients had recurrent COVID. 2/3 of our patients, like I mentioned before, had a rise in serum creatinine, and 1 out of every 8 of the patients had a biopsy-proven acute rejection within 3 months of diagnosis of COVID. And serum creatinine did not return to baseline in 7.9% of the patients. On multiple logistic regression, only co-infections and need for mechanical ventilation came out to be the factors associated with mortality. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Since we are short of time, I think you should go to the next presenter. Even though I'd like to ask Dr. Deepesh, was monoclonal with the antibody cocktail given to any of your patients?
No, this is only the first wave, and the antibody cocktail was available after that. So we have the second wave analysis which will address that.
I think we'll get a better result by that time.
Yes, yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, moderators. Moving on, I'd like to invite Dr. Sarpreet Singh, and the topic of his presentation is application of ex vivo normothermic machine perfusion to salvage a discarded kidney from an uncontrolled donation after cardiac death donor with successful kidney transplantation.
So, good evening to all, and I will be presenting on application of ex vivo normothermic machine perfusion to salvage a discarded kidney from an uncontrolled DCD with a successful kidney transplantation. So as we all know that the organ requirement is much higher than what is available. So there is a dire need to increase the organ donor pool, and this normothermic machine perfusion has been shown to improve transplant recipient outcome who had received the DCD kidneys. So in addition to organ viability and assessment, normothermic perfusion restores viable organ function and reduces cold ischemia induced injury. In most of the center, the cutoff of 2 to 4 hours of functional warm ischemia, which we define as a systolic blood pressure of less than 50 in a donor, in such a scenario, most of the center will take a cutoff for 2 to 4 to accept as a DCD donor, and ideal time should be less than 30 minutes. So, currently, by using normothermic machine perfusion as resuscitation, viability assessment, and reconditioning tool for discarded kidney, based on this functional warm ischemia and uncontrolled DCD and subsequent kidney transplantation. So, this is the machine which is used for normothermic machine perfusion, is the kidney assist, which provides the physiological condition to the organ and have oxygenated blood at normal temperature, which acts for the preservation, assessment, and reconditioning, and which suppresses the injurious process and upregulate the protective pathways. So coming to our case, was a 23-year-old male with a road traffic accident, and on hospital admission, his BP was unrecordable, and after fluid resuscitation, it picked up, but he remained on triple inotropes throughout the stay, and he was hypothermic, and all the septic work was negative. And investigation-wise, on the time of admission, his creatinine was 0.9, but subsequently, due to persistent hypertension and inotropic requirement, he had AKI along with the hepatitis. As we can see, the creatinine rose to 5 internally, and liver enzyme also increased to 10 times. So as the family has given consent, but not able to, because hemodynamically instability, not able to proceed with the brain death certification, so DCD consent was taken. So this shows that he remained hypotensive for a long period, and pre-terminally he had almost anuric for the last 5-6 hours, and total hospital stay was around 48 hours. So once he had an arrest, he was immediately taken to operation theatre, and rapid phlebotomy was done, and after doing the cold flush with the HTK, kidneys were retrieved, and total warm ischemia time from arrest to retrieval was 35 minutes, and subsequently the kidneys were put on machine, and the fluid which was used was basically based on the Cambridge protocol. We used 2 leukodepleted PRBC along with saline, mannitol, dexamethasone, heparin, bicarb, NTG, glucose, oxygen, and antibiotics. And the kidney was kept on the machine for around 190 minutes, and these were the perfusion parameters. And we can say we achieved the renal artery flow of 73 ml per minute, and though the lactate was in the range of 10 to 13, and the end of perfusion it was 11. And while on machine, it was able to clear the hyperkalemia, which was around 8, it came down to 5.6, and subsequently kidney produced urine about 20 ml per hour. So these are the perfusion parameters I have always discussed, and the potassium was came down from 8 to 5.6. So this is the interoperative photographs which were taken. The kidney was well perfused, and the pressure was good at the declamping, and these are the Doppler parameter done interoperatively, which showed RA of 0.73. And these are the parameters on the machine for the kidney assist or the perfusion machine, showing the vascular resistance, temperature, and flow rate. And the kidney was transplanted into a 41-year-old male with a warm ischemia time of around 10.5 hours, and he received triple immunosuppression along with ATG, and he had some DGF requiring dialysis for 2 weeks. And the other issue during the hospital stay, he had hypotension led to fistula thrombosis and low TAC level, which were managed with adding peconazole. And a biopsy was done on day 4, which showed a severe ATM with some cast. And
Sorry for the
subsequently
interruption,
he was
sir.
discharged with creatinine of 3 and 3.4 at 3 weeks, and achieved minimum creatinine of 1.2 by 6 weeks. From 3 at the time of discharge to 10 to 1.2, and now it's around 1 at 6 months, and subsequently it's now 8 months, and this creatinine is around 1. And this is the biopsy which I have already told having cast and ATM. And as to conclude that by using ex vivo normothermic machine perfusion as a resuscitation and pre-transplant viability assessment tool for the quality check of discarded kidney, and uncontrolled DCD or marginal donor will result in increase in the organ yield, and we can have more organ to be transplanted and cut short the waiting period.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, moderators. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Asha Thomas V. The topic of our presentation is Clinical Spectrum of Infections in Renal Transplant Recipients, a single center experience from South India.
Good evening, everyone. Topic for my podium presentation today is Spectrum of Infections in Renal Transplant Recipients, a single center study from South India. Regarding the aims and objectives, the primary objective of my study is to determine the incidence of clinically and microbiologically proven infections in renal transplant recipients who underwent renal transplant between June 2016 to June 2019 at our study center. The secondary objective of my study is to evaluate the risk factors pertaining to the development of these infections. Methodology. In this retrospective cross-sectional study, all the patients who underwent renal transplant between June 2016 to 2019 were included. The medical records were reviewed for demographic data, transplant protocol, and infections till the available follow-up period. Patients with acute rejection and those who did not have a minimum of 6 months follow-up were excluded from the study. Regarding the results, total of 98 patients underwent renal transplant between the study period of 3 years, and after excluding 7 patients who had less than 6 months follow-up and 1 patient who developed acute rejection immediately post-renal transplant, remaining 90 patients were included. And regarding the demographic data of the study population, the mean age of the study population was 35 years with male predominance, with the most common basic kidney disease being chronic glomerulonephritis followed by diabetic nephropathy. The mean follow-up period of the study population was 17 months, and among the transplant type, the most common type was live-related transplant followed by cadaveric transplant and 2 swab transplant. And regarding the donor profile, the most common donor was the mother, and around 21% of the patients developed a new onset diabetes after transplant. And with regard to the induction agent used, the most common induction agent used was ATG, followed by nil induction and basiliximab induction. And out of the 90 patients, around 65.5% of the patients had documented infection, with the most common infection being urinary tract infection, with the most common agent being Klebsiella pneumoniae. The incidence of urinary tract infection was around 81%, which was followed by CMV viremia, which was seen in around 8.9%. And out of the 90 patients who were studied over the 3-year follow-up period, around 8 patients died. The major cause of mortality was fungal infection. One out of 8 developed graft kidney mucor, which led to death within 1 month post transplant. 3 out of 8 developed fungal pneumonia due to mucor, which led to their mortality. 2 patients developed urinary sepsis due to Candida tropicalis, which led to systemic sepsis and death. 1 patient developed bacterial infection, which led to sepsis with MODS with DIC, and 1 patient died due to multiple cerebral abscess. And regarding the timeline of infection, as you can see, urinary tract infection was the most common infection in the less than 1 month group, 1 to 6 month group, as well as more than 6 months group. The CMV infection was most commonly seen in the 1 to 6 month group. And regarding fungal infection, as you can see in the table, it was almost equally distributed among all the 3 groups. with the graft mucor occurring less than 1 month post-transplant and 2 incidents of candidal UTI occurring less than 1 month post-transplant, with the fungal pneumonia due to mucor occurring 1 to 6 months and more than 6 months post-transplant. And regarding the risk factor correlation with the outcome, though majority of the infection, that is number-wise, majority of the infection occurred in female sex in patients who had new onset diabetes after transplant and those in whom ATG was used as an induction agent, these associations were not found to be statistically significant with a p-value of more than 0.05. So concluding, what was known before is the infection rate post-renal transplant are likely to change with the changing demographics as well as the changing immunosuppressive protocol, as we have come a long way from cyclosporin, azathioprine to tacrolimus and MMFs. So this study provides a modern infection rate for comparison by other institutions, and it highlights the need for targeted trials aimed at reducing specific infections like urinary tract infection post-renal transplant. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asha. Thank you.
Now I invite our final presenter of the second session, Dr. Ilayaraja Arumugam. The topic of his free paper is Post-Transplant Lymphoproliferative Disorder, a case series from a tertiary care hospital.
My topic is post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorders, a case series from a tertiary care hospital. Post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorders are lymphoid or plasmacytic proliferations that occurs in the setting of solid organ or allogenic hematopoietic cell transplantation as a result of immunosuppression. PTLD 70% are EB positive. The cumulative incidence over 5 years is from 1 to 3% in renal transplant. More than 80% occurs in the first year after transplant. My first case, 56-year-old male, he underwent renal transplant in 1990s. In March 2015, he had intermittent fever with cough. Chest X-ray and CT chest of nodular infiltrate in the left upper and middle zone. Fibrotic bronchoscopy showed a solitary nodule occluding the left main bronchus. Biopsy from the nodule showed diffuse B-cell lymphoma, EBPCR negative. He was treated with immunosuppression R-CHOP. He lost to follow-up. Come to the second case, 40-year-old male, he underwent kidney transplant in 2006. In May 2021, he had onset GTCS without fever. CT brain showed left temporal lobe mass. CF study includes toxoplasmosis, meningitis were negative. Initial biopsy was deferred in a small lesion. So he empirically started on ATT. CF study includes toxoplasmosis and meningitis were negative. Initial biopsy was deferred.
Sir, your voice is breaking, sir.
For 2 months.
We can't hear you properly.
I'm hearing you.
Sir, there's some connectivity issue. We can't hear you, sir. I'm so sorry. We are already running late. With this, we have come to an end of another session. I thank all the speakers and the moderators for their valuable time. Thank you.